Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar, Seeding Success, Cover Crop Best Practices in the Tainter Creek Watershed with Karl Dallefeld from Prairie Creek Seed. I'm Kelsey Virgin, and I'm a program manager with the Pasture Project at the Wall Center, who is hosting this webinar today, along with Danny Heisler from Valley Stewardship Network. To start us off, I'm first going to go over the logistics and how-tos for the webinar system. Then I will talk briefly about the Pasture Project and Valley Stewardship Network and our partnership. Then we will do some audience polling where we will ask some questions that will appear on your screen. After that, we'll get into our presentation, and then we'll have about 10 to 15 minutes for your questions at the end. In terms of the webinar technology, you should see the GoToWebinar control panel on the side of your screen. It should look something like this with the presentation on the left and the control panel on the right. You can minimize and maximize by clicking the orange arrow at the top. You'll want to use your control panel during the presentation, so it's best to keep it maximized. You can also click the small triangles below to open and close different parts of the panel, such as the questions pane. You will be in listen mode only during the presentation to minimize background noise, but as you have them, please ask questions in the questions pane throughout the presentation. These will be addressed after the formal presentation during the Q&A time, but if you need clarification at any point or have technical difficulties, ask at any time. There will be a short follow-up survey that pops up just after the webinar is over. Please take a moment to complete this. It helps us as we develop our future webinars. I will note that folks calling in without access to a computer will have limited functionality. You will not be able to do polls or ask questions. This webinar is being recorded and it will be available in the coming week on the Pasture Project website and YouTube channel. All right, let's get into some introductions. So the Pasture Project is part of the Resilient Agriculture and Ecosystems Initiative of the Wall Center at Winrock International. Pasture Project works to advance and integrate regenerative grazing as a scalable, market-driven solution for building healthy soil, viable farms, and resilient communities in the upper Midwest, and specifically in a 6-state region in the upper Mississippi River Basin, although we do work with some national audiences. Valley Stewardship Network, or VSN, works to protect land and water through research, education, and community involvement in the Kickapoo and neighboring watersheds in Wisconsin. VSN provides educational resources, workshops, and conservation assessments to increase farm BMPs for the watershed stewardship. VSN also facilitates the formation and supports activities of the farmer-led watershed councils. Pasture Project and VSN, along with the Tainter Creek Farmer-Led Watershed Council, have partnered together to form the Tainter Creek Grazing Project. This 3-year project provides grazing resources and education to support regenerative grazing in the watershed. The goal of the project is to work with farmers and landowners in Tainter Creek Watershed to directly reduce nutrient and sediment loss through adoption of regenerative grazing practices. Examples of supported practices include conversion of cropland to pasture, transition from continuous to rotational grazing, and the use of cover crops as forage. This webinar series is part of our education outreach efforts. Please visit our websites or contact us for information about our work and to stay up to date on future webinars. So before we introduce the speaker, we're going to do some polling questions to help us get a feel for who's in the room. My colleague Jane will launch the questions onto your screens. Here we go, and pick the most relevant answer. So what is the primary role you currently have in farming? All right, so it looks like about half mixed crop and livestock producer and some agency folks. Interesting, no row croppers or land leasing folks. All right, we have another one. How many years of experience do you have with cover crops if you're a producer? All right, so looks like most of y'all, there's a nice spread. But it looks like the majority is at the beginning stage, which is great. I think that that and then this presentation will kind of cover the breadth of that. So on to our presenter today. Karl has been involved with agronomy for the past 30 years and utilizes forages and cover crops in his own cattle operation. He has made a name for himself throughout the seed industry by speaking about forages and practical management in the US and Canada at numerous educational presentations and conferences. In 2009, Karl co-founded Prairie Creek Seed to provide the best genetics and management advice to farmers. Karl is driven to support agriculture and farmers as they work to improve their profitability and land stewardship. Karl oversees the company's operations, is a leader in developing forage products, assists with general sales, and provides tech support, and continues to teach producers the benefits of utilizing high quality forages and focusing on soil health. So thank you, Karl. We're lucky to have your expertise today, and I'm going to hand it off to you.
Thank you, Kelsey. Today we wanted to talk about some of the best management practices for the Tainter Creek watershed area. And before we get started on some of that, I think one of the main things that we need to do if we're looking at cover crops, and it looked like a lot of you have some good years of experience with it, and some might be just beginning. One of the things I like to look at is making sure that you have an important step, which is to have that crop plan. And one of the things when we're talking about cover crops is if it's in a crop rotation, what herbicide program are you using? Are you going to have limitations or potential issues with herbicide carryover? So one of the things to do there is look at what your row crop program is, and then talk with your agronomy person and look to see, if there's going to be some things that need to be eliminated from a cover crop program. Another thing is to plan ahead, looking out to the future, what your goals are for your cover crop, whether that be if it's going to be for forage, we're going to need adequate growth in order to get the best growth from your cover crop. And then look at your overall farm and look at windows of opportunity to apply cover crops. And I will go through some of the windows here in a minute, but early spring is an opportunity for a cover crop after small grains. There's been a lot of talk about interseeding cover crops in both narrow and wide rows, and then after high moisture corn or corn silage. And then don't delay on the planting. Every day that goes by, especially in the fall, we lose growing degree days. Somebody once said that one day in September is worth 5 days in October. And you think about it in the fall when our daylight gets shorter and we start cooling out at night, we're not going to get the total growth from our cover crops that we might want. And then be thinking about next spring. Think forward about crop termination and whether you're going to harvest that cover crop in the spring, if it's cereal rye or triticale or something like that for a forage, or if you want it to basically, what I'll call self-terminate over the winter. So be looking at what kind of a plan and what your goals and objectives are for your cover crop. So looking at some of the best times to incorporate cover crops into your farming operation, we look at kind of the calendar here as the winter opportune times to plant cover crops, and looking where you're located. And we're actually, Prairie Creek Seed is down here southwest of Dubuque, and then we travel a lot through Wisconsin, Minnesota, Iowa, and surrounding states. There are different periods when you can plant a cover crop. I call it pre-plant cool season, which would be in the early spring after small grains. But as you look, there are different opportunities for different timings for planting a cover crop. There are also a large list of potential cover crop species. There are literally hundreds of different options of people can plant for cover crops. I like to suggest that people start with what works in our area, and then over time, get the basis down, and then over time consider adding additional species to it. And then try to have one or two of each of grasses, legume, and then a brassica or forb. The grasses will depend on the time of season, but we do a lot in the summer with sorghum sedans, millets. Those would be warm seasons. And in the spring, a lot of times we'll mix oats and barley, or oats and spring triticale as an example. A lot of people will use peas, and then maybe might come in with crimson clover, balansa clover in the summer and fall. And then brassicas, we want to watch the timing on those. When you get a radish planted early in the spring, it tends to want to bolt and flower and not really put down a deep taproot or bulk up the tuber. But there are brassicas that are taprooted that will not bolt as quickly, so they're better for the spring. And I'll talk a little bit more later about the seed size differences and why it's important for planting depth. We hear a lot of talk about mixed cocktail type of cover crops. Sometimes we're breaking that out a little bit. But when we look at seeding rates, two things that I come to mind are your seed size will factor into the seeding rates. So if it's a real small seed, such as let's say turnip or a hybrid brassica, we're going to probably be putting on in a mix less than a pound per acre. And then you get into some of the larger cover crops like faba beans. A straight seeding recommendation rate on that would be about 100 to 120 pounds per acre. It's just a large seed. And you can see just from the picture the differences in the seed size. This happens to be, I think it's about a 16-way mix where it's got cowpeas and mung beans and annual ryegrass. It's got radishes, just kind of a cocktail mix that was used as a summer fallow cover crop. And then when you're looking at putting together your seeding rates for a particular field or area, there are differences between what I would call a cover crop rate versus a forage rate. Forage rates are typically higher because we're wanting to produce as much forage as we can on top, as well as what the benefits of the root systems. So a cover crop rate is going to be, I'd just say on the average, maybe it might be 50% less than a forage rate. And the idea of that rate is not to have a full blanket of plants across the field. We want space in between the plants so that we can have the root depth, we can have the top growth, the plants can express themselves better and actually do a better job than actually being too heavy. So the slide that had all the different opportunities or windows, pre-plant cool season is typically, depending on where you're at in upper Midwest, but early March to mid-April. If you didn't get a cover crop planted in the fall, it's an opportune time to put a cover crop in it in the early spring before you plant corn. It will delay your planting a little bit, but the soils actually will be a little bit warmer and they're going to have a little more tilth to them for establishing your row crop. But that'll help on erosion control, nutrient, capturing. If you're going to come in with a warm season annual, it'd be a time to have a early summer forage. And even though these plants might not get extremely large, you may be terminating them when they're 8 to 10 inches tall. You got to remember that those small plants are actually going to feed the soil microbes very well. There's not a lot of lignin in it, and the nutrients that they're pulling up will be readily available for the coming crop. So it shouldn't deter from the row crop yield by any stretch. I would say, when we're in western Wisconsin, we're going to be looking at that early springtime being late March into early April. And if it's possible at that time to come in and drill oats, barley, winter peas would be a good option. That's a pretty simple mix, but it'll grow forage and they'll germinate at lower soil temps. And I would suggest, if it's possible to drill, if you do have to broadcast, I would run a rolling harrow or something to lightly incorporate the seed to make good soil seed contact. And again, that will delay planting the row crops a little bit, but you're also going to be picking up on the nutrients that the cover crop's going to release. Another opportunity we talk about is early interseeding, and there's been a lot of talk about this the last probably 6 or 8 years. It's a fairly narrow window, and a lot of recommendations have been from the V3 to the V6 stage, literally going in and broadcasting or drilling into the growing crop. You can see the pictures there. The one is actually the Dawn interseeding units on a toolbar. And then another option that people have been using is taking like a Great Plains drill and literally picking up the drill unit that's in the row, fairly easy to do, and then just drilling the seed in. If we're looking at broadcasting seed at that time, we're going to want to use small seed such as annual ryegrass, balansa clover, forage brassicas. Drilling or incorporating, we could get into some of the warmer season cover crops, but it's typically too early to drill those in at that time. So this would be the early, and some of the blends that I would look at for our area. Simple blend of red clover, balansa clover, annual ryegrass, hybrid brassicas work, rapeseed would work. And I would actually do this on pre-plant on corn to somewhere before the fourth leaf stage if possible. The earlier slide I said V3 to V6. We're having some farmers that are actually coming in there before they plant, right the day before they're going to plant, and drill in their cover crop. Drilling is best, and if you're going to broadcast, you want to do it earlier, and then possibly run a rotary hoe or something just to disturb the soil. You see on that list there, I have crimson clover. I'm backing off a little bit on using crimson clover before the 1st of July or 1st of August, in the fact that it doesn't seem to get the growth in the spring that I'd like. And red clover is one that is pretty durable. Works well. And then balansa clover is another one that has worked pretty decently. The other one is interseeding into wide rows or late interseeding. And there's, this is two different aspects. Wide rows are typically 60 inches. In western Minnesota, where they're running with sugar beet, some of the rows are 44 inches wide. So really, it's just a matter of your planter width that you're working with currently. And I would say earlier is better for interseeding into wide rows. And then your other opportunity, and this would be 30-inch rows or even 60-inch rows, is that black layer that you'd have to fly it on, but that'd be another time for late interseeding. So wide rows early, and this would be from when you're going to be planting the corn into the vegetative state of 5, annual ryegrass, red clover. Again, I have crimson in there and balansa. And then when I talk about the hybrid brassica, we use a variety called T Raptor. It is tap rooted, and it's going to be late maturing, but fairly fast to establish, and it's been very shade tolerant. And then rapeseed would be another one that would work. Again, drilling is best, and you can broadcast it if we have adequate moisture, but we're going to have the moisture to get the plant germinated and then also get it rooted down. This would be when we're getting a little later on the wide rows. Some of the options that people have been using would be actually teff, millet, again, the brassicas, annual ryegrass, and then the clovers. These are all things that if we can drill them, their seed sizes fit together pretty closely to where you can have that consistent depth. And then some are coming in with cowpeas at that time or sunflowers, and they would have to actually be at a little deeper depth, so they definitely would need to be drilled. After a small grain is, to me, one of the best opportunities we have to get cover crops where we can use a lot of diversity and we can really run with the warm seasons. I saw a lot of you are livestock and crop farmers. I don't know how many have small grains, but to me, it's a great opportunity to let a cover crop do the maximum that a cover crop can do. If we're going to do that, at that time, we can come in with sorghum sudan grass or hybrid sudan grass, pearl millet, cowpeas, mung beans, the list could go on and on. So they would need to be drilled at 3/4 of an inch to an inch in depth. And they really don't broadcast very well. Over the years, we've seen issues that way. One of the things is, especially, coming behind a small grain, if you wait too long, that ground starts to harden up. So if you're going to come in with the sorghum sedans and the sudan grasses, it'd be best if you could come in right behind the small grain harvest. Another opportunity with small grains is, I know we have $7 corn. But if you can feed the small grain and you need the straw, it really could be something that could fit into the operation. So on the small seed, and these would be seeds that need to be planted at 1/4 to 1/2 inch in depth, and that would be pearl millets and teff, the berseem clover, radishes. At this point, we're in mid-June to August, we can start using radishes they'll start to bulk up. Usually after about June 20th, when we get the longest day of the year, radishes go from reproductive stage into bulking up for the winter. We do need to get good soil seed contact, especially if we're coming in behind a small grain, and we do need the rain at that time. Okay, now we're getting into the harvest period. Depending on where we're at, we start to get to a point where the opportunities or the different cover crops that we can use start to diminish. And around the 10th or so of September, typically is our cutoff date for being able to add a lot of the diversity. And once we get to early August, I like switching back over to the cool seasons. So from early August to mid-September, we can still come in with ryegrass, oats, barley, peas, lentils. The clovers will still work at that time, especially if we want one that'll overwinter. And then the forage brassicas. Again, the same ones. And I would say, the 10th of September, once we get past that, we're really starting to cut off what we can use for a cover crop. So there's that period where we get to mid-September, and oats and barley, right up until that point in time, we'll get enough biomass to them to make a good cover crop. But then we get to a point where we're down to winter wheat, winter triticale, and cereal rye. And then that'll last until early October. And then we typically after that, we go straight to cereal rye as a cover crop. But I would rather have the cereal rye out there than no cover crop at all. And we all know the advantages of cereal rye in the spring for either pasture or forage or just as a good cover crop. The earlier slide that I showed had all the seed size differences, in the palm of their hand there. And I really like the cocktail mixes. I think they're great. Planting them can be a challenge because of the different seed sizes. And what I've been working on, or we've been working with producers, and I call it a 2-pack. And that's where you segregate out the small seed and the large seed. The next slide will show the differences. So when we look at the seed size between the different species, I don't know if you can actually see it on that first one that's 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch. There's a Timothy seed next to that radish seed. And we need these to be at about 1/4 to 1/2 inch in depth. And then I have the picture of the corn on there that I like to see people plant their corn at 2.5 inches in depth. But if you just look at the physical size between the different seeds, the corn, which is planted at a deeper depth, actually has a lot of energy to get it out of the ground. And those small seeds just don't have the energy to be able to push from that inch or deeper and get out of the ground well. And then you get into your cereal rye, millets, we're at that 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch. And then mung beans and cowpeas and some of those need to be about approximately an inch in depth. What kind of created that 2-pack system was, this is a farm actually west of Dubuque, and he planted what we call summer blend, which has sorghum sudan and sudan grass in it. And then it has the hybrid brassica. If you can see that field, it was mostly the brassicas. And we couldn't figure out what was going on until we started walking the field, and we could find areas where his drill was actually getting deeper into the ground, and we would have adequate amounts of the sudan grass. So what had happened was he did not have the down pressure on his drill, so it was very shallow, and that's what we get. So what we've done is starting to segregate out the sorghum sedans, plant those at the depth they need to be at, and then put into the small seed box the brassicas and clovers. You'll hear me talk a lot about it. If you have the ability to drill your seed in, it's best. And it takes about 2 weeks longer for a plant to get established if it's broadcast over being drilled. I like showing this picture. This was an issue that we had in central Illinois. Had a producer call us and just was real unhappy with with his turnips. And he said they don't even look like turnips. So I went down and took a look at it, and the ones on top there that look more like a carrot are actually a barcant turnip. So I went around the same area and I found a producer that drilled them in, and it was the same lot number. It was the same variety. And the ones on top were flown on, the ones on the bottom were drilled in. This is a picture of that same turnip that was drilled, and you can see how developed that plant is. And if you go to the next slide, you can see a picture from the aerial, and you can see in there that those plants, if you broadcast them, they have to have enough moisture to germinate, and then also have to be able to put their roots down before they can start developing the top part of the plant. And it generally costs about 2 weeks of time. So early in the spring, and then also again in the fall, if you have any opportunity to drill in your cover crops, you're going to be better off. So this is where we can go to questions and go from there.
Thank you so much, Karl. That is really good information, and I've got a pile of questions for you. So, and I'm sure you expected that, right?
That's what I prefer.
So in a couple of the recent slides, you were sharing that difference between the drilling and the broadcasting, and that kind of that maturity. Are you finding that consistent with all covers, or is that something that's a little bit more specific to like the turnips or the brassicas?
It is with all covers. When you I'll use sorghum sudan grass as an example. If it is too shallow, it's like corn being planted too shallow. We talk about corn needs to be planted at 2.5 inches. And the reason for that is that the first 5 nodes of that corn plant are the main root system. And a corn will start initiating its roots at about 3/4 of an inch under the soil surface. And if it's too shallow, it won't get all of those nodes underneath the soil for the root system. So you'll have a more massive, better plant at that proper depth. And sorghum sudan grass has a similar root system to corn. So if you plant it shallow, you just don't get the same robustness of a plant, which is what we want for a cover crop. And it's the same for grasses. They're starting their root system actually on or above the ground, and they literally have to dig down into the soil to get established.
Makes perfect sense.
So, yeah, and there's options and opportunities, things people can do. If they need to broadcast it, might need to, like I said, run a rotary harrow or something just to get it incorporated into the soil. Because a lot of them need to only be about 1/4 inch deep.
Early in the presentation, you kind of talked a little bit about warm season grasses. Can you maybe share why that's so important? In early spring seeding, why is that too early? I'm sorry. Why is it too early to plant some warm season cover crops at that point in early spring? Maybe you can share some of the differences between the warm seasons and the cool seasons.
Yes, the warm seasons all need a minimum of 60-degree soil temps, and I always say and rising, not 60 today and then 50 3 days later. They may germinate and start to grow, but it seems like it really sets them back to where they don't fully recover. So they're never, they don't have the size to them. So the cool seasons, such as oats and barley, will germinate when the soils are, pretty cold in the low 40s. So you look at the differences there. In the warm seasons, we need soils that are in the 60s. if you look at your own row crops, if you're planting corn and the soil temp is 50 degrees today and we go through a cold snap, what happens? Either we're replanting or we have delayed emergence or uneven emergence. So it's pretty similar to that. So we want to plant the different varieties when it's going to be the best for them or optimize their growth. It does give us opportunities early in the spring, and you'll have the fast growth of the oats and barley.
Have you seen, or has there been significant success with utilizing cover crops, like maybe rye, for example, in terms of controlling weeds in corn to the point where there would be almost no weed pressure? Or is there a different cover you might suggest? I guess really kind of thinking about some of our folks that are maybe trying to transition to organic or are organic, trying to manage that weed pressure that way.
Yes.
$1,000,000 question, right?
Yeah. I wish I had all the answers.
I know.
Some people have looked at using like annual ryegrass to suppress weeds, but annual ryegrass is kind of slow to establish. It just seems to, as it grows, gain steam over time. So I don't think we're going to get a lot of weed suppression that way. If we're going to use a cover to suppress weeds, we're going to want to do it at a pretty high rate. So if let's say you're certified organic and you're wanting to use cereal rye as a cover crop for weed suppression, then come in behind it with whatever, soybeans or whatever, the recommended rate would be actually about 150 pounds to get the weed suppression. And then that could be, you want to use an early variety, and that could be rolled and crimped, and then, drilled into and then rolled and crimped. But you're going to want a higher seeding rates if you're going to use a cover crop as a weed suppressant.
Okay.
So oats, we would be looking at probably 3 bushel as well, those kind of seeding rates.
By seeding covers at the time of planting corn, are you worried about yield drag due to competition?
Not totally.
All right.
If we're talking 30-inch rows, I think that earlier might be better. There's been a lot of success with interseeding early into 30-inch rows in central and western Minnesota. I don't know if we're getting a little far south for that, so that extra timing would be very beneficial. You look at if the soil temps are over 50 degrees and the corn, pops out of the ground within 3 or 4 days, you look at how long it takes annual ryegrass and clovers to get established. They're not going to be big enough to be taking away nutrients and moisture from the corn plants at that time. And the goal, if it's 30-inch rows, is to get enough root reserves built up in the cover crop to withstand the shading period that they're going to have through June through August. So that's the key. 60-inch rows, they're starting to try it now, so it'll be interesting to see how that turns out. But for the 30-inch rows, it's gone earlier and earlier for the interseeding. I like the idea of the 60s. Yep.
Do you have some tips on the 60-inch rows to kind of keep that, to maintain that yield, but still have that cover crop growth?
I think the real value in 60-inch rows is the ability to graze it at the end of the season. I don't know if on the 60-inch rows, if we're ever going to see it out yield what we can do on 30-inch rows. I think the best thing we can do is on the 60s is try to pull back our population a little bit and use flex ear types to try to get bigger ears, less population, so we can reduce our inputs and make it economically better than 30-inch rows over just strictly a yield. Right now, I don't know what others have seen. Maybe they could chime in any comparisons of 30s against 60s. But I've heard everywhere from 5%, 7% yield reduction to actually in some locations a little bit of a yield bump on poor soils. So it'd be interesting to see what everybody has come up with.
Yeah, sounds like there's significant value in those 60-inch row systems to, consider that grazable forage later in the season.
Correct. Now, to me, that's if we can get 1 to 2 ton dry matter, I'm talking on a dry matter basis, forage yield at the end of the season and still have close to the same corn yield, that's the cows out grazing and utilizing the cover crops, and economically it's going to win right there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sounds like a great opportunity for some more local trials, huh?
Yes, and I don't know that 60s are the end all answer. That's just taking 30-inch rows and shutting a unit off. Maybe the ideal is 40 or 50 inches, so where you can kind of maximize both. I've wondered about 4 rows of corn and then maybe a strip of cover crop. 4 to 8 rows of corn, strip of cover crop. At least a third of your field will have a cover crop, and you can alternate it around. And would that be more economically viable?
Mm-hmm.
Just the farmers. You farmers are the ones that are driving it.
Yeah.
And that will make it work.
Yeah. Well, you're getting my wheels turning on some ideas out here, so that's good. Kind of touching back to that, using a cover crop as a weed suppressant, is there a live cover that you might be able to interseed or utilize to kind of suppress those weeds, or is it really, I guess you talked a little bit about planting rye early, planting into that and then crimping it down as kind of that weed suppressant, but is there something live that you can use that's fairly effective?
You're thinking something like a white clover, to where you could plant into it, set back the clover and have it regenerate. It runs on stolon, so it's running across the top of the ground to help suppress weeds. Organically, they've been trying it in western Minnesota and haven't had the success that they wanted. I'm not saying that it wouldn't work, but having a live cover would be a great idea. The issue sometimes is being able to suppress it back long enough to get the corn plant established. And remember, it's a perennial plant, so it's already got its root system, so we might be pulling a little bit of nutrients and moisture away from the corn as well. Yeah, but it's well worth trying.
Yeah, if you planted the white clover at the same time as the corn, would that white clover get established before that corn? Okay.
No, it would have to be from the previous year, and then
Okay.
just work the area where the row is going to be, and then plant the corn in. We had a handful of people that will plant like cereal rye in the spring, and then plant beans into it as weed suppression, and they've had mixed results. It's just all this is pretty new. For corn, there was a producer that planted spring peas early and let them get established, and then as he was planting his corn, he was creating that area away from the peas to get established, and then he flamed out the peas, and that worked reasonably well, but it's always hard to keep all the weed pressure out.
If you're using clover as a cover crop and wanting to take a nitrogen credit for the following year, how early would you need to establish that clover?
I would say mid-August to late August would be about the latest to be able to do that. And if I wanted to carry over into the next year, we're going to want to use red clover. Where we're at, Crimson and Balanza are hit and miss, and mostly miss on winter survival. So red clover is something that you could get that nitrogen credit from. A lot of, we hear a lot about like Crimson clover and Balanza and how many units of nitrogen they'll produce, but that tends to be in southern Illinois, where it overwinters well, and it's a good knee high when they terminate it the next year. That's how you get the big nitrogen credits from the those types of clovers. Our best bet's red clover if we're going to try to do that. Yeah.
Okay.
Or alfalfa, something that we know is going to be winter hardy.
Are there any other questions that anybody has for Karl? I mean, I could probably keep coming up with questions all day, but I think, I'm not sure everybody wants to listen to me ask questions.
Thank you, Karl, so much for taking the time today to present with us. And thank you, Danny, for hosting this webinar with me. You'll see all of our contact information listed here. Feel free to reach out about anything. This webinar, like I said, it was being recorded and it will be posted on our Pasture Project YouTube channel. We'll share that around. There is a survey that you're going to see pop up. We really ask that you fill that out because it helps us determine future webinars. We welcome all kinds of feedback and we thank you for attending, and keep a lookout for future webinars between Pasture Project and Valley Stewardship Network.
Thank you.